I'm Brenda Hiatt, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit HankGarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Brenda Hiatt.
It's episode 230 of the Author Stories Podcast. Thanks for listening, everybody. Before we get into today's fantastic interview with Brenda Hiatt, the second episode of this week, we're going to have 5 total. This month, like I told you yesterday, is a slam-packed month. We've got more interviews than ever before for your listening pleasure. But you know who makes it possible for me to do all the shows we do? Our wonderful sponsors. And if you would like to sponsor the show and get your product or service out to our large and diverse audience, go to HankGarner.com and click on the link in the top sidebar. Today, we are sponsored by Peter Codron and his book Retrograde. The international team at the Mars Endeavour colony is prepared for every eventuality except one. What happens when disaster strikes Earth? This book is fantastic. If you are a fan of The Martian, this has kind of that sort of feel to it. I love this book. I love when I got to talk with Peter on the show a couple of weeks ago. Go pick up the book Retrograde. You're going to absolutely love it. The Paragons trilogy by C. Stephen Manley. When dark portals open, heroes will awaken. This is so much fun. Part science fiction horror thriller, part superhero novel. Awakened. Paragon's Book 1 is the first novel in a trilogy series. It provides a gripping origin story filled with mystery, fast-paced action, horrific monsters, and fringe science. If you enjoy a thriller novel with a heavy dose of the fantastic, you'll love Awakened. The entire trilogy is available now. Go pick it up from C. Stephen Manley. Also, thanks to Richard Fox, winner of the 2017 Dragon Award. His 9-book series, The Ember War Saga, is available now. All 9 books. If you're like me, you don't want to jump into a series until, there's a little bit to it, because nothing is worse than getting involved in something and then waiting for them to come out. Go pick up The Ember War Saga. You're going to love it. Military sci-fi at its very best. Also, thanks to Daniel Arthur Smith for sponsoring with Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. The brand new Halloween episode is out, and you're going to love, love, love the cover. I'll just tell you this. Good grief. It's Halloween. Go check out that cover. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned, my absolute favorite monthly publication. Go pick it up. Also, thanks to Bob Williams and his newly re-released book, Music City Macabre and Arch City Apocalypse. Bob published these books a while back, but realized that they needed a little something extra, and he pulled them down and he sent them to our friend Crystal Watanabe at Pico's house, and she reworked these books and made them even better than they already were. Bob has gotten new covers. These things are fantastic. Go pick up these 2 books. He also bundled them together as one volume if you'd like to get it that way. There's a link to it in the show notes. Thanks to all our sponsors for sponsoring this week. And as always, at the end of the show, there's an audio clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Thank you for listening. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Brenda Hiatt on the show today. Brenda is the author of 22 or more books at this point, and all genres. She writes kind of across the spectrum, which is one thing that I really love about Brenda and her work, is that like so many of us readers, we don't read in just one genre or, dip from one bucket. I have lots of different interests. And I think as writers, that's something that we like to explore, is to look at different things that we can challenge ourselves with and express ourselves. And it's really cool when a writer is able to do that and find readers for all of those things. So really excited to talk to Brenda today. Welcome to the show, Brenda Hiatt.
Well, thank you, Hank. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're most welcome. I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Well, I'm not sure I can pinpoint a particular spot, but I've told stories as a kid all the time. I didn't write them down generally, but I made up stuff all the time, sometimes to make trouble or to scare my friends or whatever, mislead my friends. But I also did we played a ton of make-believe games, and I may have been the driving force behind that because I loved make-believe. And I mean, by the time I was probably 5 or 6 years old, I was getting my friends to play along with these scenarios that I would concoct as we went along. So I've been doing storytelling pretty much my whole life, even though I didn't ever think at the time that I would become a writer.
I love it. Do you come from a family of storytellers?
Well, it's interesting. My father died when I was very young, when I was 7, and I didn't discover until just a few years ago when I reconnected with some people from that side of the family that he did some writing and storytelling, before I was born that I never knew anything about. So I guess I did, but I didn't know it.
Oh, how cool! So, I'm always fascinated in the kind of nature versus nurture argument. Are we born this way, or is it, or are we a product of our surroundings? And sometimes it's a little bit of each, and it's kind of weird when those genes rear their head, and it makes us feel like there's maybe more going on than we ever imagined.
I think that's true. I really do.
So what was your first experience with writing down some of these stories and interactive fiction that you subjected your friends to? When did you decide to put this on paper and make a go of that?
Well, I tell you what, I was a voracious reader my whole life. I was always into books. I can remember as a kid, Bookmobile Day was huge.
Yeah.
We had a bookmobile that came through my neighborhood, and that was huge. So, and I at the school library, I was always upset that I couldn't take out more books at a time, that sort of thing. But I don't think I really thought seriously about writing fiction myself until, college or even grad school, honestly. As strange as that sounds, I was a science major. I double majored in biology and psychology in college.
Wow.
And then I went for a master's degree in wildlife science. I was going to be the next, Marlon Perkins or whatever. Discovered I wasn't that into camping. But I took a creative writing class in grad school just for fun. Actually, partly because I had a crush on a guy who was taking the class, who I never did actually go out with. But
like you do.
Like you do. And I ended up enjoying it a lot and also getting really good grades in it and encouragement from the professor to do more with it. He actually, with my permission, entered a short story of mine into a campus contest, and I took second place. And I mean, that caught me completely by surprise. It was kind of we were supposed to write something in the style of an author we admired, and I wrote a story that I called Cedric the Sedentary Centaur, written in the style of Tolkien in The Hobbit.
I love it. Oh, there's a very odd thread that is woven through so many writers' experience, and that thread is Tolkien and The Hobbit specifically. And it's very strange. You see writers of all stripe and that write all sorts of genre, and Tolkien rears his head in all of these stories, or a great many of them. And it's very strange. What sorts of things did you said you were a voracious reader when you were younger. What sorts of things did you devour, and what kinds of stories really grabbed your attention?
Well, as a kid, I read, I remember I just glommed onto the C.S. Lewis Narnia books.
Yeah.
In fact, that may have been like that. I think that was like a leap ahead in my reading ability, because a teacher was reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe aloud in class, a chapter a day. and I wasn't willing to wait. So I talked my mom into getting the book for me and read it myself. And I was probably in third grade, maybe. So second or third grade. It was above what should have been my reading level, but I just wasn't willing to wait for the rest of the story. And I read all the animal books that my school library had in elementary school. I mean, all the Black Stallion books, all the, just anything about animals I could get my hand on. And then in high school was when I started really discovering, I kind of went back to the fantasy thing, with The Hobbit, and a friend of mine introduced me to the Piers Anthony Xanth books, things like that, Anne McCaffrey. So in high school, I really started getting into science fiction, fantasy type reading. And I went through my Gothic phase where I not to be confused with goth today, but just reading the Gothics that were so popular in the 70s, the Mary Stuart and Phyllis Whitney, those type kind of spooky romancy sort of books. I got into those. And I loved Jane Austen as well. I loved the Jane Austen books. I think the first one I had to read as an assignment in high school and fell in love with those as well. So that was my introduction to historical romance.
And you've written a number of Regency books, traditional Regency romances, and I definitely see the Jane Austen influence there for sure. I think a lot of readers, if they're not writers themselves, maybe kind of assume that a writer, if you write in a particular genre, then you have just immersed yourself in that genre, and that's the thing that you love the most. You have such an eclectic background of books that you liked, and your storytelling, you could tell, is really informed by all of those things. What do you think it is about immersing yourself in all of these different types of stories that allow you to come and tell something new and fresh as a writer?
Well, what I think that like the historical romances, the Regencies in particular, and the fantasy science fiction type books have in common is a built world that's not quite our world. So those are the books I've never really gotten into are the ones that are too reality based. Set in our world and just normal people doing normal things. I see that on the news. That's just not, that's not where I go for my fiction reading. And I think, and it's funny, I have actually a lot of crossover readers between my Regencies and my STARSTRUCK books, which are, science fiction romance books with a built world. And I think it is that world. They like to go back to this world that someone has created for them. I was never even good at history in school. And, I never really was interested in history in school. It wasn't until I started writing those Regencies that I started really doing the research and digging into the history and discovered, it's pretty interesting stuff after all.
There were actually stories then that were intriguing and it kind of makes what happens today pale when you really start digging into
right.
history. So you had this double science major, or a major and a minor in science, and then got your master's degree. Did you go to work as a scientist, or did you put your science degrees to work?
Well, I never I've never had a job that used any of that. Well, I ended up getting married right out of grad school, and my husband was going into the Army. He had an Army scholarship, and so he was going into the Army, and I went with him to Hawaii, actually,
nice.
For our first assignment. I know it's a dirty job, but
somebody's got to do it, huh?
So it was like a 3-year honeymoon. It was great. Our first daughter was born there. But it's hard for a military wife to get a job in a place like Hawaii. So I was actually working as a bookkeeper for a restaurant for a while. And then I started, until I got pregnant, basically. And I actually started writing stories at that point, but not with any real seriousness yet. It was mostly with pencil and paper just to keep myself occupied, especially when he was like on a deployment or something. But yeah.
Wow. So what was the thing, where did the bug bite you, to make you want to try to start writing stories of your own? So you're living in paradise. You guys are having an extended honeymoon. Did it start there? The writing did. In fact, I started the book that eventually became my first full novel with pencil and paper while I was in Hawaii, and then I set it aside. My first daughter was born, and I kind of set it aside and never looked at it again for the longest time. And it wasn't until I was home with 2 toddlers and my very first computer. That was important because I wasn't much of a typist, and the idea of typing an entire book on a typewriter was very intimidating to me. Yeah.
So, but with my first computer, which was, by today's standards, was, an antique. It was a Mac SE30, I believe, one of the early Macintoshes. And I decided that, I was home with the 2 kids anyway, and I thought, if I'm ever going to try this is probably the best time. So I actually wrote, because I had kids, I guess, I wrote a few children's stories, and sent them off to like Highlights magazine and other places like that. I got some flattering rejection letters, but nobody bought any of them. And then I pulled out that beginnings of a story I had started back in Hawaii and looked at it and started working on that. And that became my first full novel. I wrote during nap time.
Wow.
And it took me about a year to write that first book. And it was not the first book I sold, but it was the first book I wrote.
Yeah, and that happens to a lot of folks. A lot of folks have that good desk drawer novel that you get it out of your system and you say, "Wow, no one will ever see this," and then you go on to write another one, and sometimes you come back and edit that first one and do something with it, and sometimes you bury it in a hole in the backyard and hope nobody ever sees it.
Right. That one I actually did eventually sell, but it was so much better by then than it had been when I first wrote it.
Right.
I had learned so much more about the craft by then.
Sure.
I think it was my 7th sale.
Oh, so, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, being a voracious reader like you were, a lot of folks will tell you one of the best things you can do to get better at the craft of writing is to read a lot. And there's a lot that, and that's absolutely true. You have to read a lot to write. I totally believe that. And you understand how books are structured and how story works and all of that stuff from reading and seeing how other people have done it and seeing what resonated with you and what didn't and what worked and what didn't. You can learn a lot by studying other people. It's also a very different thing to sit down and do it for yourself and to put your fingers on the keyboard or pick up the pencil or however, you start. What were some things that you learned from taking the story idea from your head and getting it into the computer and, getting a story from beginning to end? What things did you learn that maybe you didn't anticipate or you couldn't anticipate until you actually did the writing for yourself?
Well, by the time I started really writing my first book, which was a Regency romance, I had read dozens and dozens of Regency romances by then. So many of them. I thought, okay, I've got this. I know this period inside out. I'm solid. I can tell one of these stories. And I start writing, and I'm probably maybe a page in when I'm realizing, okay, what time did they eat? What did they eat? Those basic questions like that I just hadn't realized I would need to know all that stuff. And so I ended up having to do a ton of research, to feel like I was getting it right. And I didn't expect that. I thought I could just write. But no, I had to go back and do so much research, which back in those days was not nearly as easy as it is now, because this was before the internet.
Yeah, we're really spoiled.
Yeah.
So you start researching and you fill in the gaps as you go along. How long did it take you to get through that first book?
It took me a full year to write that first book. And then I went to I didn't know any other writers at the time, none. I didn't have a single writer friend. I went to the bookstore to see who was publishing those kinds of books. And I sent off query letters. I got a book on, what to do if you're trying to sell writing. I think it was the old How to Write a Romance Novel and Get It Published that had come out right about that time in the late 80s or thereabouts. And I went to the bookstore to see who was publishing Regency romances, which were still very big right then at that time in the late 80s. Those were huge. And there were probably six or seven publishers doing those. So I wrote a query letter to every one of those publishers. And the first one that actually asked to see a manuscript was Harlequin. They had a Harlequin Regency line then, which doesn't exist anymore. And so I sent off my manuscript. And 6 months later, on my birthday, this is true, I got a rejection letter. But it was an encouraging rejection letter, which after I got over being crushed, because I had spent that 6 months imagining, fame and fortune and glory, of course, because they were going to immediately recognize the genius in this work. But I think, doesn't every starting out writer think that? I think we all do. We think that the most pivotal work of genius that has ever been put on paper. But I got the rejection letter, but it was encouraging enough that the editor actually said that if I had anything else, she would be interested in seeing it. And by then I had written most of a second book. So I finished up that second manuscript, keeping their guidelines a little more in mind this time, because the first one was much too long for their line and had a few other things. So the second one fit their guidelines more closely, and sent that off. And then 6 months after that, I got another letter back that I thought was another rejection letter until I read it through about 5 times and realized it was actually a revision letter. That if I changes, she would look at it again. So, needless to say, it was things like I had a lot of beginner mistakes. My viewpoint was all over the place. I head hopped all over the place. I think I got into chairs viewpoints. Anybody that walked on screen got a viewpoint. It was,
So lots of head hopping.
Head hopping, and also I had conflict resolution all the way through the book. And she specifically suggested that I have the conflicts build and then start resolving it all closer to the end. So I was moving whole scenes and chapters around and then, having to smooth it all out. But I did that revision. I was so stoked that I did those revisions in, less than 2 months.
Wow.
6 weeks. I was spending every moment I possibly could on this, and sent that back. And it was still another several months before I got a phone call. So, and ended up selling that book, the second one I wrote, to Harlequin Regency.
You talked about Regency being really big there at the late 80s, and there being a huge market. I think there was a bit of a downturn with that genre for a while, and it seems
it collapsed completely. The short traditional Regencies, as they were called, they're kind of sweet books. There was no sex in them,
right.
Kind of comedy manners type romances, were hugely popular throughout the 80s. I'd say from the mid 70s through the late 80s into the very early 90s. Those were very popular. They weren't the only thing popular, obviously, but those were really popular. But that was also when the bigger, meatier, sexier historical romances were starting to take off.
Right.
Kathleen Woodiwiss and all those big ones were starting, and those just kind of squeezed out and the Regencies. Those were making so much more money for the publishers that they just started dropping their little Regency lines.
Yeah.
Right now. And Harlequin did too. They just stop that line. So I did a total of 6 Regencies for them before they just dropped the line entirely.
There seems to have been a kind of a resurgence in Regency in the last few years. What do you think has brought people's attention back around to these kinds of stories?
Well, it's always been a popular setting, even for the bigger historical romances.
Right.
And it's probably the most popular setting right now. The Regencies and Victorian are the 2 most popular settings in historical romance, which is still a very big genre. I'm still not seeing, at least traditionally published, a lot of the shorter, sweeter traditional Regencies. That doesn't seem to have made a big comeback. But in ebooks, it's making a comeback. And I think a lot of it is those authors from way back then getting their rights back and then putting up their old books and finding a new audience with them. I know that has been happening with me. That has definitely been happening with me. I've given new life to those old Regencies, and they're doing quite nicely for me now.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get into that, and I want to focus first because that's a fascinating part of your story and one that definitely needs to be highlighted. But what happened when Harlequin kind of rolled up that line, and then all of a sudden you published 6 books and you don't have a home for those anymore?
Yeah, that was tough. I also did write a time travel romance for Harlequin for one of the other lines in that time.
Oh, nice.
It was a fun book, and I still love that book, Bridge Over Time. But other authors that I knew, by then, were recommending. Mary Jo Putney in particular, I remember, took me aside at a conference and said, "You need to write a historical romance set in the Regency, a longer, sexier book set in the same time period. Those are selling." And I took her advice. I'm not going to, turn down advice from Mary Jo Putney. And she's big. If you may not have heard of her, but
Sure.
She's very big in historical romance. And I sat down and did just that. And that was Scandalous Virtue, which was the first single title, not as part of like a packaged line like the Harlequins were. My first single title novel, and I sold that to HarperCollins. And went on to sell several more books. I think a total of 8 books to HarperCollins over the next few years.
Nice. What was the switch for you in writing the kind of the traditional Regency and then switching over to the historical romance? You said that you kind of had to spice them up a little bit. Was that a difficult switch for you to make? And
it was a little bit. My books are not even that now or even then, whatever. My books were never all that steamy compared to some other authors, I'll say. I don't think that's my strongest suit. I tend to focus much more on the emotions than on the physical parts of the sex scenes and that sort of thing. And I know that there are a lot of readers out there that really love the hot erotic books, and I'm not one of those readers, and I'm not one of those writers, which is kind of too bad because they make a lot of money. But I'm just not. It's just not my area of interest for that.
Right.
And but also because they were bigger books, I put a lot more plot into them. I mean, adventure plots. I started putting a lot of adventure and also a lot more real history into them. I would get a lot of my plot ideas from real history and weave some real historical characters in as minor characters. And that's fun. But it was really easy to get sucked down the research rabbit hole, and suddenly hours have gone by. That's especially easy now with Google, but hours go by and I haven't written a word, but I know everything there is to know about breeding foxhounds or something.
Yes. How did readers respond to you shifting gears and going to these more plot-heavy books and you paying more attention to detail to the history and all of that? Did some of your older readers come over with you and how was their response to what you were doing?
They did. I mean, back then we didn't have as much contact with readers
Right.
as we do. They would write us actual letters And that's what we would hear from readers. And not many take the time and trouble to do that. But I mostly got positive feedback. I got good reviews in the magazines that were reviewing back then for my books. So I think it was mostly positive. And I mean, face it, those earlier readers kind of had to move on or not have books to read because nobody was doing those little Regencies anymore. So if they still wanted to read historical romance, they kind of had to shift with the times as well. Of course, some just switched to other genres, I'm sure.
Right. So you signed to HarperCollins and you wrote a series of books for them. How many books did you write for them? It was
8 total.
Okay.
8 books total.
Gotcha. So that brings you up to 14 or 15 books that you had published at that point. At what point did you consider yourself kind of a veteran of this and say, I think I'm kind of a pro at this by now?
Does anybody ever reach that point?
I don't think they do. That was a trick question of the day. Yeah, every book you start on, you're still like, oh God, I don't think I can do this.
Yeah, but I mean, I taught writing classes and stuff for years. I did writing workshops online. And then I started actually teaching writing classes online. So, I mean, I just felt like I was further along than the ones who hadn't made it yet. And I was just sharing what I had learned along the way for the most part. I think I may have moderated the longest running ever online weekly workshop on AOL, which was one of the only online services back then. That was when you still paid for internet by the minute. And I did a weekly novel workshop for 20 years.
Wow.
20 years, yeah. Yeah, from the mid 80s until the 2004 or something. I did that for 20 years.
Nice.
It was my Tuesday night. Every Tuesday night, I'd spend an hour doing that.
That is awesome.
It was just to help writers, and I became really passionate about helping them avoid the pitfalls that are lurking everywhere for aspiring authors. Because there's so many people out there wanting to take advantage.
Yeah. Especially, we're really fortunate. We live in a time now where self-publishing is actually viable, and people are making a career out of self-publishing, and it's not looked down upon like it once was. But there still are some people that kind of hang out on the fringes, and they're just looking for people to take advantage of and to, sell these crazy packages to. And I've met so many authors that, have these books that they put everything into them, and then they wound up paying someone like $15,000 to publish their book, and they have a garage full of paperbacks.
I did my best to steer writers away all the time. I constantly was steering people away from stuff like that. One of my mantras that I tried to drum into them over and over was, the money flows toward the writer. The money should always flow toward the writer.
Exactly.
So and I even did, I still have it up on my website. I haven't updated it in a year and a half now, but I do what show me the money thing on my website, where I've done this for, probably 15 years now, where I did surveys of what authors were earning from the publishers, and then I put that up on my website so people had a place to go to see how much they could expect to earn from which publishers, and kind of separate the wheat from the chaff with the publishers.
Yeah, I would imagine that that was surprising for a lot of people in some cases.
A lot of the publishers did not like it. They did not like me doing that, I have to say.
Did you get input from any of them?
But see, back in the early days of e-publishing, there were some predatory e-publishers out there,
right?
And the authors were making nothing. They were making nothing, but they had this group of very loyal authors who would sing their praises and how wonderful they were to work with, and completely gloss over the fact that they weren't making any money at it. And I started actually putting up the data I was getting back from authors anonymously. I mean, I wasn't anonymous, but all these authors, I always guaranteed absolute anonymity to anybody that answered my stuff. And I deleted everything that was sent to me as soon as I put it into my database. I mean, I would write down their numbers and delete the email. So even if I were subpoenaed, I could not, produce it, because I actually had 2 e-publishers threaten to sue me for publishing that information.
Really?
Yes, because it was hurting their business.
Well, good on you.
But yeah, it was kind of an adversarial time back then at the very beginnings, before e-publishing. This was pre-Kindle,
right.
And it took quite a few years before it was possible to make real money e-publishing books.
Well, yeah, and kind of in the beginning, in the early days of the internet and stuff, you would see people, selling an ebook, and it would be a PDF file, and those things never really took off because there was no convenient way to read it, and but there were always those people looking to just take advantage of people. It's horrendous, the stuff that's happened. It's crazy. But they say that if you want to really learn something, then you should begin teaching someone that thing, that you learn so much through the process of teaching. In teaching this workshop for so many years, what are some of the things that you learned through the teaching of the thing?
I'll tell you, just going back and back and back to the basics of craft was wonderful. And in the classes that I taught for a while, I did more structured classes for a while too, that I actually made money at for a while back when people would pay you for that sort of thing. No, AOL had an online campus back in the day, and the teachers actually got decent money from that. And then they made it all free, and it was like, okay.
Thanks a lot, AOL.
Back and back over the basics was really good for my own writing. I mean, it would remind me when I needed to be reminded that, okay, I'm losing sight of the whole show don't tell thing, or that, the building conflict and things like that. So raising the stakes, if things start to sag, make more be at stake, all those sorts of things that I would keep reminding other people of, and therefore reminding myself, and it would suddenly be, oh yeah, well, no wonder this scene is dragging. I'm not doing that. Very helpful.
Right. We were talking right before we started recording about your STARSTRUCK series, and you've got this really cool teen YA science fiction romance kind of. It's really a mashup of a bunch of different genres, and I've been reading the first book, STARSTRUCK, and it's so much fun. And I know I'm a 45-ish year old man, and I shouldn't enjoy this book, but it was so much fun. It's so well written. I live with a house full of teenage girls, and I was laughing, and I love your wit and just your craft. Where did this series of books come from?
Okay, this is a fun story. I've told this story, when I've had other interviews and things, but it is a fun story. Back when I was in elementary school, in third grade or thereabouts, there was a girl in my class who for a while, I mean, it seemed like all year, I'm sure it was probably a month, if that, but insisted to everyone who would listen that she was really a Martian princess. And that her parents were going to, come and take her at one day, her royal parents. And we made fun of her, tried to trick her into admitting that she'd made it up. She wouldn't budge. And I forgot all about that for years and years and years until I was a writer. And, I had already written several books at this point. And suddenly she occurred to me again. Something brought it to mind, and I remembered that. Out of, something in conversation or whatever. And with my writer brain, I immediately thought, what if she was telling the truth? That pretty much was the genesis of my STARSTRUCK series. It's all woven around the what if way back then that girl was telling the truth.
I love it. You know, people ask, you know, a lot of times they're like, where do you get your ideas from? And, you know, if you're a you know, a real writer, you say, well, you don't get them anywhere. You just, you know, listen, and the ideas are all around you. You just have to learn to pay attention.
I got an entire book out of one line of a song I heard on the radio. Just, it's amazing. Just anything, a snippet of conversation you overhear in the checkout line, or something in the news. That's a biggie. A lot of people get story ideas out of things in the news. There's just so, stories are everywhere. Every movie I watch, every book I read, I have what if it had gone this way instead? And that can spark a whole book idea. So, yeah, they are absolutely everywhere, those story ideas. It's just once you become sensitized to looking for them, you know, I'm not going to live long enough to write all the ideas.
I know. I know. That's the two great fears, is that you won't live long enough to read all the books you want to read, nor write all the books you want to write.
And which is why it's so funny and it's inevitable. Any author who's done book signings, you know, physical book signings, has had this. The person that comes up to you and says, I've got this great idea. How about I tell you my idea and you write it and we'll split the money?
And you're like, no, don't tell me, don't tell me.
What? Nobody can do justice to your idea like you can. You know, and I've already got so many more ideas than I'm going to have time to write anyway. You know, you go do your own story. But yeah, everybody thinks that it's, you know, that the idea is the hard part, and then, you know, somebody can type, can write it.
Sure. Your STARSTRUCK series is so different from your Regency series that you have. How was the writing different? And you've got it's modern time. It's it's teenagers. It's modern teenagers, and there's a science fiction element. There's kind of a fantasy element, an adventure element. How was the writing and the conceptualizing of this series different from the stuff you had done before?
First person, which all my historicals were third person. Well, I had started reading a lot. I kind of skipped over this part earlier when we were talking about my writing history, but I had, after writing all those books for HarperCollins, I got burned out. I had several tight deadlines in a row, and I got very burned out. And I actually took 2 years off from writing at all. And in that time, I read a lot, and to include, I started reading a lot of young adult fiction. I read, the Harry Potter books, and I read The Hunger Games. I read Twilight to see what the big deal was. And at first I was rolling my eyes, and then when I got my mind into the mindset of a 15-year-old girl, suddenly I totally got why it was so big. But not until I could get into that mindset. And then as I read more of these types of books, I realized I was enjoying reading them so much more than anything else I was reading at the time. And I thought, well, gee, maybe I should try my hand at writing one. And I had that idea that I told you about, but the girl in elementary school had been in the back of my mind for a while. I was like, okay, I'm going to see if I can turn that into a young adult novel. The hardest transition for me was the voice, getting the voice right after writing all those historicals, to get the modern teenage speak, and not have it be more stilted and more formal, and that took some work. It probably took me close to 2 years to get STARSTRUCK where I wanted it, because it was so new and so different, and I was so determined to get it right. I had a lot of beta readers. I had teenagers read it for me. I had my own daughters read it. I had a lot of people read it and give me feedback on ways to make it better, before I finally got it to the point where I felt like it was even ready to send out to agents or anything. Because I was still intending to traditionally publish at that point.
You bring up a really great point just a minute ago that I really want to highlight here for just a second, in that you talked about you had some really tight deadlines for a while and you were just burned out. In today's market where so many people are self-publishing and a lot of genres, readers are expecting kind of book after book after book, maybe one every 90 days. Some people are publishing every 30 to 60 days and having tremendous success, and lots of fortunes are being made, and all of this kind of stuff, and kudos to them. A lot of those folks are my friends, and I love what they're doing. But it is a very real possibility that the writer can get burned out from just cranking out so much work all the time. And then the sad thing is that no one wants to read a book written by a burned out writer, because if the writer's not having fun, the reader's probably not having fun. What advice would you have for folks to maybe prevent themselves from just burning it, at both ends and becoming dissatisfied with the process?
I think that writers today, and I agree. I mean, some of these writers are making a ton of money turning out books very, very quickly. I know authors who publish a book every 4 to 6 weeks. I mean, and I can't even conceive of that. I'm a very slow writer. I can't even conceive of that. Though I wrote my last 2 historicals I wrote for HarperCollins, I wrote in 3 months each. And I mean, that about killed me. I can't even imagine doing a book, having a book from start to publication in 4 to 6 weeks. That just seems insane to me. But there are authors doing that. They're younger than I am. But I think they need to be alert for the signs of burnout. And some are already talking about being burned out because they've been doing this and they're neglecting their families, they're neglecting their health, and the work isn't fun anymore. That's what happened to me. Writing just wasn't fun anymore. It was a chore. I got to where I would rather scrub toilets than go to my computer and write. It was that bad. But I had a contract and I had to do it, and that's how it felt. And it just totally stunned me that those last couple of books seemed to be as popular with my readers as any of the earlier ones. But because I definitely wasn't having as much fun while writing them.
Right. And just to be clear, we're not down on anyone publishing quickly, and that's not the point. The point is to, as a writer, take care of yourself, so that you don't get burned out.
Very, very important. And I think a lot of writers in their pursuit of the golden ring neglect that balance and figure, okay, I can catch up later. But if you've got young kids, you don't get those years back. You don't get that time back. And if your health goes, you may not get that back. There are things that are probably too important to trade off for making, an extra $100,000 this year or whatever. There are things more important than the money. But when it's new and when they get giddy at the money they can make, and I think they really can lose sight of that.
Well, and a lot of folks, look forward to making that extra money to share with their family so that we can live better and we can take more vacations and all of that. And then you realize you're caught in the trap that, I can't do those things because I've got to keep cranking out work and, Yeah. Anyway, that was a sidetrack, but I think that was important for someone. I think, it's something we need to be aware of for sure.
To those signs when it starts feeling more like a chore and not something you look forward to. If your family starts getting resentful that they're not getting enough of your time, I mean, you just have to pay attention to that stuff.
Yeah. So we've alluded to it a couple of times in the show here, but the indie revolution happened, the Kindle revolution happened, and ebook publishing became a force to be reckoned with, and a lot of your old works you started getting the rights back to, and you actually have had a kind of a second career resurgence in republishing some of your old works as well as some of your new works like STARSTRUCK. How did that happen for you, and what's that experience been like for you?
I was still sending STARSTRUCK out on submission, to agents, and I had an agent for a while that was sending it out and things. And while all of this is going on, and of course that's a very slow process on the traditional side of things, I was at the same time getting rights back to my older books. And I started asking, as soon as I heard that authors were starting to make money with putting up their own books as ebooks, I started getting my rights back. And I started early enough that I was able to do that before publishers started really locking down those rights. It's much harder these days. But I got all my rights back from my HarperCollins books, and then I, one by one, pried my Regencies out of Harlequin's greedy little hands. That was much harder. But I eventually got them all back. And as I got them back, I started, I would, if I had the digital file, I would use that, and I would go back through it and re-edit it and tweak it, and then I learned how to format it, because we didn't have all these services yet. Now there's tons of people out there who will do this for you for money. But in the early days, we mostly had to learn how to do this ourselves, and it was quite the learning curve. But I put one book at a time. I got out there and put on Kindle and on the other platforms that existed at the time. And then a little at a time, I put my first book up, I think it was in late 2010. And by the end of 2011, I had several books up. And then in 2000, I think it may have been 2000, it was either 2012 or 2013, I made more money from my old books, indie publishing my old books, than I had ever made in a single year traditionally publishing. And that was an epiphany.
I'll bet it was.
So, it was about at that point that I decided, forget this groveling to agents thing and editors. I'm going to self-publish my STARSTRUCK books too. And I got some really good cover art made. That is not my forte. I do not attempt my own cover art. I would never do that. But I know how to find good people. And got really dynamite covers made, and did everything I could to put them out as professionally as I possibly could, and started self-publishing the STARSTRUCK books. And I submitted the first one in particular, STARSTRUCK, to a lot of contests to try to get a little more visibility, and it won several awards, which helped, which is a nice thing to be able to put on the books, sales pages, on the vendors, things like that. And I just kind of kept learning. I networked with a lot of other authors online, and we trade, what's working and what's not, and it's just a continual learning process. It is a lot of work, I will say. Even though I'm a slow writer, I'm still putting in long days every day in this business. I'm working much harder than I ever did traditionally publishing. But it's also more fun. I have so much more control. I can approve my cover art, which is amazing. That. I can't have an editor saying, no, we're going to need 3 more sex scenes in this book. No, I had that happen. Yeah,
oh
you just shoehorn them in there, I just.
Well, could there be a more awkward conversation?
As I republished my steamier historicals, I toned them down a bit before republishing them. Partly because I had been, pressured to put in steamier stuff than I was comfortable with at the time, and partly because I was now putting up the young adult books, and so sure. I mean, those still books are not really appropriate to young teens, but they're by no means erotica. I mean, they're far removed from that. So
And that is that's a very real thing, is that I know when I read a book that I really love, I'll go to Amazon or wherever, or go to that author's website and go see what else they've written. And a lot of times I will read another book by them that maybe I wouldn't have read before, because maybe the cover doesn't appeal to me or whatever the reason. But now I love that author, so I'll go get into that book, and most of the time I love that book as well. So yeah, that's a very real thing that you have to be aware that you are going to get a lot of bleed over from readers.
I
and
get reviews. I mean, posted on Amazon and Goodreads and places. I have reviews and emails from readers saying I had only ever read your Regencies, but decided to give STARSTRUCK a try, and now I'm hooked. And vice versa. I've had it go the other way too. So yeah, readers definitely are more adventurous than I think we sometimes give them credit for.
Yeah, for sure. Brenda, there are a lot of writers that listen to the show, as well as readers. And, so when I have someone like you who has, lots of experience with teaching the craft and with, educating people for as long as you have, could you, give a piece of advice to the writing audience? If you've got someone who is wanting to be a storyteller and to be a writer, is there one thing that kind of comes up over and over again that you might share with them?
You actually said it yourself earlier on. My number one piece of advice is to read, read, read. And not just to read, but to read analytically. Read a lot in the genre you're targeting, but read in other genres as well. And pay attention to what those authors are doing. If necessary, read with a highlighter in your hand, or do the highlights on your reading device if you're reading it electronically, and make notes to yourself as you go. It's like, oh, that was a great scene. Why was that a great scene? That sort of thing. I think that's huge. I don't think there's any substitute for that. I think that is absolutely my number one piece of advice.
Wonderful. Brenda, I've had so much fun chatting with you. If the listening audience are not familiar with your work, where can they find you online?
My website is BrendaHiatt.com. That's Hiatt with an I instead of a Y. And I also have a StarStruckSeries.com website attached to that, but it's got its own URL. You can go straight to StarStruckSeries.com as well. And when you're there, you can see all the books I have are there. A lot of them have excerpts there. I've got a newsletter, and subscribers to my newsletter get 2 free short stories, one Regency and one in the STARSTRUCK world, to give them a sample of what my writing is like, so they can decide if they want to try my books.
Nice. And you're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of the usual suspects. Yes, I've got a Facebook
page, and Brenda Hiatt, Facebook.com/Brenda Hiatt. That's me. And I'm on Twitter as Brenda_Hiatt. I'm on Instagram as Brenda Hiatt. So yes, I'm out there. The teams do Instagram a lot, so I'm on Instagram.
Wonderful. Brenda, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I have really enjoyed this.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Tune in for new episodes every Tuesday and Friday. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
His body broke free of its paralysis, and he stumbled forward, losing his balance. He fell down the slope towards the spot where they had been. His hand shot out unthinkingly, and he grabbed the corner of the black stone bridge. Hoofbeats. Pounding hoofbeats. Coming closer. Coming up the road. Someone or something galloped towards him. The head of an emaciated horse burst from the gloom of the road. The rider was fumbling, out of control, without saddle or bridle, clutching at the white mane, kicking the beast across the hindquarters with his thin legs, his face a frozen mask of terror. He whipped around to look back over his shoulder. Something chased him. Something terrible. Jason spun away as the horse ran over him, spearing him through the chest with its iron-shod hooves. He was unhurt. The horse galloped upward and across the bridge, across strong timbers, rough-hewn and knot-holed. The rider wheeled the horse about, looking back from the far shore. He was wheezing. A sloppy white ruffle bobbed under his chin. His face was hopeful now, a familiar face, much like the one Jason saw every morning in the mirror. Something thundered up behind Jason, not with a clatter of hoofbeats, but with the teeth-rattling thunder of stone on stone. Ichabod, yes, of course, the man was Ichabod, wailed, and the sound of his terror echoed across the valley. The hot breath of a horse burned the back of Jason's neck. He stood frozen, unable to turn his head to see the thing behind him. He didn't want to. This was no ordinary vision. He felt with certainty that the rider behind him, no, the horseman behind him, knew he was there. Ichabod kicked his horse. It reared, brayed, and would have thrown him but for the fistfuls of its mane he clutched. Horse and rider spun in place on the far side of the bridge, disoriented. The horseman behind Jason laughed, a terrible, deep, cracking sound from all directions like 1,000 axes chopping down the woods. Jason felt searing heat as a ball of flame whipped over his shoulder. A burning jack-o'-lantern arced across the bridge. Its maniacal face spun end over end. It grinned back at Jason for an instant, spun around and crashed into Ichabod's temple, knocking him from his horse and into the dust. The pumpkin careened upwards, exploding against the trees, shooting tendrils of flame up their trunks, igniting branches and showering the world with sparks and flaming leaves. Jason recoiled, fell to his knees, and threw his arms over his face. His lungs and heart pumped wildly. They slowed. He brought his arms down. The bridge was broken again. It was over.